Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and envies, and thank you for tuning back into St. Andrew TV, a cure for your Monday blues. I am your host, Discount Jesus, and today we are going to make yet another recipe from the Old West, and actually that predates the Old West. We are going to be making cornbread, and the recipe we will be using is out of the 1824 cookbook, the Virginia Housewife. As we get further into the video, you will notice that there are some things that don't rightly make sense with this recipe. And I would agree with you. However, we are going to make it straight out of the 1824 cookbook. And we are going to make it as realistic to the time as we possibly can. So, let's get into it. As we begin today, I tried my best to replicate somebody who is driving through the Oregon Trail, and I even have my little Oregon Trail pin on today. So we start with the little excerpt from the Virginia Housewife that reads, cornmeal bread. So as the recipe says, we are starting with 1 pint of cornmeal. And 1 pint, for those of you who don't know, is 2 cups. And I knew that prior to this. I didn't look that up 15 minutes before pressing record. And we're just gonna put it in our bowl here. Let's go back to the beginning of the recipe where it's calling for butter. It reads, rub a piece of butter the size of an egg into a pint of cornmeal, which we've already done. So here is our pint of butter with our eggs. You can see that the egg is roughly the same size as the butter. And all you do is make sure it's room temperature, and you just roll it up in your hand like so. Close enough, I would say, and we're going to place it in our cornmeal. Then the recipe says, make a batter with 2 eggs and some milk. So let's crack the eggs and then we'll get into the amount of milk that we're going to be using. All right, now it calls for milk, and to my knowledge, a half cup or a very generous half cup, so if you're more towards the 2/3 or 3/4, that's not a big deal, because we are going to try to get that butter down into a more watery consistency to make sure that it mixes well with the cornmeal. So I did a generous amount that would be designated maybe as a half cup, you know, if you squint your eyes well enough, but that's exactly what we have here. This is a half cup of whole milk. And it's looking good so far in our historically accurate mixing bowl. This is our concoction so far, and I'm going to start giving it a good mix. Now, as I'm stirring this up, note that there is going to be one more ingredient, and this is probably also the time that I should mention that this is where you need to make sure your butter is room temperature. Otherwise, it will not break down and become a part of the batter. You will get chunks of butter. Make sure it sits out for a good long while, and you will have no problems. This is also the point in the video I should note that you should have your pan ready to go, and it should be greased with butter, or if you would like to be more historically accurate, some sort of animal fat, bacon, beef. Make sure it's greased so this very, very fine concoction we're making does not stick. This is going to be somewhat different than cornbread that you can buy today. It's going to be a lot more fine. There is going to be no flour or baking soda in this particular mix, which is one of the odd things that I caught, but it makes sense if you are a pioneer traveling west or you are out in the country in a rural setting. Come to think of it, I don't even know how old baking soda is. Means I've read a numerous amount of old recipes and I've never seen baking soda, at least yet. I'm sure if you went to a major metropolitan, it was somewhere around, you know, the latter half of the Victorian era. Now that I'm done using this obviously historically accurate whisk, we're gonna do it old school because this butter's having trouble breaking down, and we're actually gonna use our hands to form it into a dough, and then we will get to the yeast portion of the video. So all we're gonna do is make sure that butter is nice and dissolved, and you can actually feel how fine this is going to be once you pat it down in the pan. And I will go over that when we get to that part, but you can see a very, very gritty dough here. You can see how it just kind of comes apart with even the slightest amount of pressure. But that does ensure that the butter is nice and mixed in with your milk and your eggs. So, means my hands are already filthy and all this is going to get washed anyway, I'm just going to use the spoon to get the yeast. And this does call for a spoonful of yeast, but I took it upon myself to realize a spoonful back in that time, we don't have this nice silverware that we do anymore. So when they say a spoonful, I did 2 because they weren't using, modern kitchen utensils to measure. So I'm actually going to take 2 spoonfuls of yeast here and add it to my concoction with my filthy hands. Here's our yeast. There's 1 nice spoonful, and here is 2. I'm making a mess, but if you're wondering, this is how you store yeast, and this is probably how they stored yeast back in that time. Just make sure it is in an airtight container because you can use yeast indefinitely, as long as air doesn't get to it. I've never smelled yeast that went bad, but I can only assume with the smell of proofed yeast, which is over here, it's not going to smell very pleasant. However, I digress. Let's get back to mixing. And before anybody wants to sit there and say, what a mess you're making, this is pretty accurate. This is how you knead dough. They didn't have these fancy utensils that we do now to make the task a little simpler. They had to make do with what they got. And if you were a pioneer going on the Oregon Trail in 1843 or even a little bit later than that, you packed light and you didn't really have all the room in the world for luxury items. You had to make the best out of what you had. Utility was the name of the game when you're traveling at least 2,200 miles across the country. This is what it looks like, and this is actually a greased up cast iron that I used to make my initial go, my trial run. I used the exact same process that you see here, and what I did is put it into the greased pan. I greased it with butter because I did not have any animal fat on hand. I suppose I could have greased up bacon, but I digress. And you actually sit it, historically, next to the fire or the oven that you're going to cook it on to make sure it stays warm but doesn't cook, and allow the yeast to rise, and you're going to do that for 1 hour. And this one has been sitting for 1 hour. This is what this turned into when you pack it, yes, pack it into your cast iron, and you should actually see it jiggle a little bit, knowing that the yeast is in full effect. There is some air in your dough now, and this is where you're going to place it in your oven. I don't know how many of you actually have access to an oven or something that would be cooked a little bit more historically accurate. However, I'm going to put it in to modern day standards at 375 for give or take 25 to 30 minutes. With that being said, I'm assuming you're going to cook it until it is a golden brown, and even the picture that I did see when you use this particular recipe is you even have some burnt spots. This is supposed to be a savory kind of treat with your main course, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to place it in there for 25 to 30 minutes. I will correct it if need be. Now the recipe does call for you to put it into smaller pans to actually bake it. I do not have any smaller pans on standby. I am not a baker by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm using it more as a survival food in this instance. These are very simple ingredients to take with you if you're traveling a longer distance. And like I said, luxury is not something that you are going to be able to do in that setting. So I took it upon myself to just bake it in the pan that the yeast rose in, because that's probably ideally what you're going to want to do. And then you can use a knife or any utensil to scoop out the desired portion that you want. Anyway, I'm going to let that sit in the oven for any amount of time that it takes to complete, and then we will have our taste test. All right, so these took about 35 minutes apiece in the oven. Now, if you were to bake them in a traditional sense, it might take less time. I'm not sure. But as you can see, this is about 35 minutes in the oven at 375. I make 2 batches, as you can see. We have one that just came out. That's why it is unreasonably warm on the cast iron here. And then we have some that has been sat and rested for a while. All that there is left to do is give it a taste test. So let's try our cornbread. This recipe comes to us by the Virginia Housewife in 1824 by Mary Randolph. Let's see how it tastes. So my immediate reaction is that it's missing salt, and that was one of the main things about this recipe that I noticed. Now, let's not get confused here. I'm not an expert in terms of baking, but I was always under the impression that you needed salt in some capacity. And I don't know if Mary Randolph just had the idea that that's just common knowledge in the baking world, that you add salt when you're making dough, but I'm some dumbass on the Oregon Trail with a recipe book, and I never added salt, and the recipe never called for it. So that's the first thing that pops into my mind, is it is missing salt. However, I do like that it has the traditional cornbread taste. I know there are a lot of modern cornbread mixes out there, or even modern cornbread is made more sweet, where it's almost like a cupcake or like a muffin of sorts. But in my opinion, it misses the traditional taste of cornbread, which is that gritty, that almost dry taste that you get in your mouth. And you definitely get that with this cornbread. It's very dry, very gritty, as I said. I actually prefer my cornbread to taste like it did traditionally. It has a little bit of a, sandpaper element to it. It tastes like it should. So if you like the traditional taste of cornbread, the traditional feeling in your palate, this is definitely something that you will sink your teeth into and, quite frankly, really enjoy. Now, I am going to add a little bit of butter to my next bite. And of course, I used salted butter because, like I said, what is really missing is some salt. So maybe if you make the 21st century rendition of cornmeal bread, you add a little pinch of salt in there. It would definitely go a long way, but with that being said, definitely a very tasty treat and a very hearty treat if you were trying to make it out in the wilderness, or maybe you were on that long drive out west in search of a better life. But what better way to wash down some old style cornbread is with some black coffee. Now that's living. Now that my mouth is no longer full and my mother's jaws are no longer clenched, I can tell you thank you for getting this far into the video and making with me today 1820s style cornbread. I put the recipe up already, but it is easy enough to find. It is the 1824 cookbook, The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph. Please leave a like if you've enjoyed today's video, or leave me a comment stating what you liked, or tell me what I should do next. I have a Patreon that has been opened up for a few months now. I take great pride in being community funded and community funded only. You will never see sponsorships or ads on these videos, so you know that they have never been influenced by external forces, keeping the content homegrown and grassrooted. But that is not to say to feel any obligation to donate to the Patreon. Only if your means allow you to do so. The content on YouTube will forever remain free. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed as of late. But for those of you who have come across this video or this channel, maybe because you like Wild West content, maybe you just wanted to learn a new recipe, or maybe you saw my brand new hat and thought, wow, he is the boss of the plains. Think about hitting that subscribe button, because you're a daisy if you do. You're all gonna love this easy one-dish recipe.